Scientist Labs, Janine Young, newscientist.com.
Yes, Janine Young joining us in Melbourne City today. Hello to you, Janine.
Good morning to you.
Lovely to see you once again. Let's crack straight into it. First one is an oddball kind of story. Well, kind of. What is going on inside your head may, in fact, not be normal or may be normal. Actually, I don't know.
Compared to the rest of the world, it would appear that the likes of you and I, and indeed the people who read and indeed write New Scientist, are in fact weird. And I don't mean, just a little bit kind of odd. It's an actual definition. Western, educated, industrialised, rich and democratic. It's a nice acronym. And it would turn out to be true if you start looking at cognition studies in different cultures. For a long time, psychologists have relied on students, for example, who were to hand, who was convenient to be able to study things. Turns out that they tended to be weird. They tended to be 96% weird, for example.
Yeah.
And you think to yourself, well, okay, that's not such a problem, is it? I mean, there's nothing wrong with being Western educated, blah, blah, blah. Well, no, there's nothing wrong with it, but it does give a slightly skewed point of view of how our brains work. Because it turns out we're different, basically, from the rest of the world. Take, for example, this illusion. I think most people would be familiar with this one. Can you see it?
That's where you've got a line with an arrow on each side, and that's A, and then a line with inverse arrows, and that's called B. Yes?
I keep forgetting that this is radio. Yes. The whole video thing has done my head in.
Did I describe that correctly?
Beautifully, yes. What it is that you have two lines. One has inverse arrows, the other has arrows pointing the other direction. And to a weird person like you and I, it's very likely that A is going to look different to B. Now, a bunch of researchers went to a lot of different cultures and said, okay, which line looks shorter? And it was interesting that adjusting for the culture and how people see the world, they were then able to adjust to work out how much different they would have to be to make them look similar. Now, kids in Illinois in the United States needed to move it by about 20%, whereas the San people from the Kalahari Desert basically looked at it and went, well, there's no difference. What are you talking about? There is no illusion.
Huh.
So it was quite interesting, and there was a range in between. They just didn't see any kind of issue at all. It's very likely tied up in the fact that you and I, and indeed students in Illinois, live in a very geometric environment.
Yeah.
They're not certain about this mechanism, but they think it's probably tied into the fact that we have a lot of straight lines around us, a lot of carpentry. So that means that we're used to how lines fit together, which means we're much more sensitive to an illusion like this one than people in the Kalahari Desert who are unlikely to have seen a straight line in any kind of aspect of their lives because everything is natural and curved and the like. Now, these are native Aboriginal people, so they're living a bit different than, say, those in the Philippines. And it was a sliding scale from America right the way through the Kalahari Desert. Fascinating. We also have different ways of considering ourselves. Now, in terms of the way we look at ourselves, we tend to be individuals. Whereas if you go to an Eastern country, they tend to be very collectivist, part of the collective, part of a greater whole of society. We don't see ourselves that way. We're encouraged from a very early age to be an individual, to stand out, to make ourselves special. I think most people would know the sorts of things that I'm talking about here. The whole idea is to be special. It doesn't work that way pretty much through the rest of the Eastern and the rest of the world. You fit into society. You're kind of making sure that you're part of the greater collective whole. You don't get that here. Interestingly, this ties in with the fact that Westerners tend to be fairly analytical. Science ties in with this particularly well when you think about it, whereas the rest of the world seems to think from a much more holistic point of view, paying attention to patterns and context instead of looking at laws and that kind of thing. It's a really different way of looking at the world. We're the outliers. We're the ones that are at the extremes of the the continuum.
Yeah.
We're the literally weird ones.
Yeah.
There's so many other examples. Morality. There's a bunch of different examples as to how it is that we're literally weird. And this is fascinating because it means that researchers are now going to have to go back to their research and look for their biases and their prejudices. Even the paper that this is based on was saying it was written by weird people, so therefore we're going to have to watch our biases. Yeah. Fascinating.
So this really is a problem across the whole human sciences, really, isn't it? The fact that generally only Western people are studied and the stuff that goes into journals is from, easy access studies, really, from people within a certain community. That really does pose a problem.
It really does, because the way we look at the world, if you want to think about it, is wrong compared to the rest of the world. So getting these ideas about cognition are wrong compared to the way the rest of the world functions, as opposed to the west of the world. Being industrialized and rich has changed our brains. When people go out into the forest in America, they will call 75% of the vegetation out there trees, whereas a bunch of other civilizations will be able to say, well, they're beeches and that's an elm and that's a specific type of conifer, and they're able to identify things by genus, whereas most people can't do that because we're not associated with nature in the same way. Now, that's not to say that someone living in Beijing is going to be able to do it necessarily either, but they may be able to do it slightly differently from the way we do. Fascinating. Right. It has real implications for the way we work out how our brains work.
It does. Well, so we can be wrong about that, but can we also be wrong about clay? You'd think something as simple as clay, moving on to the next story, Janine, this is a segue. Yes. You'd think, clay, we know everything about clay, but apparently there have been some more recent sort of discoveries about the property of clay and how strong it is.
Clay is not just the annoying stuff you find in your garden that when it rains makes a mess. It's not the only thing that clay is good for. It's also potentially being able to be used in really, really strong materials. For a long time, alternatives to carbon nanofibers have been a really important thing because the environmental cost associated with it is immense. It needs to be heated to around 1,500 degrees Celsius. It really requires a massive input. And so looking at other more natural substances like, say, just for example, mother of pearl, what that is a mix, something called aragonite, which is a type of calcium carbonate that gets mixed in with proteins and biopolymers. They're put together in a kind of bricks and mortar structure. So they're kind of laid together in platelets. And the structure that they have means that if, say, a hungry seagull comes along, gives it a tap to try and get into it, then the pressure, that massive force that's brought down from the beak, has to then zigzag along each of these plates, the bricks, if you like, and the force is dissipated. And it's immensely strong. The structure is brilliantly put together so that you don't have to be too concerned about what happens to it because it is strong. So materials engineers looked at that and went, well, why can't we do it? Because on its own, aragonite is actually quite brittle, it's quite soft, and it's actually not a great structure. So if you can put it together with other things, I thought, well, surely we can do the same thing with clay. Because on its own, it's really not all that great. It doesn't actually do really all that much aside from clog up the garden and the like. But Toyota in 1985 decided to mix it up with nylon, and the structure that they used for that, they were able to eventually take it and put it into the cam belt covers for their engines, and they've found a bunch of other uses for it since then. So in trying to take clay, it can actually be used, but the problem is that if you take any more than 5% of clay in this mix, then it loses its strength. So they've been looking for different structures trying to mimic this mother of pearl. They do have a way of being able to build it up layer by layer. Unfortunately, it's not terribly efficient. It's certainly not up to commercial scale that people are going to want to use for things like cars and aeroplanes and the like. That's not quite working yet, but they do have a system where they can go layer by layer and start building this up into a very, very strong substance. I think that may actually give Kevlar a run for its money.
Wow.
That's pretty impressive stuff. So I think now by using electrodes and different structures to be able to to layer these a lot more quickly and a lot more efficiently, that you may in fact be able to do this on a commercial scale.
And one day we might return back to the clay tablet in the form of a phone. Who knows?
Well, we are running out of the tin oxide. I think it's called tin oxide.
Yeah.
We talked about that a few weeks ago. So your touch phones are an endangered species.
Indeed. Janine Young, thanks so much for that.
See you next week.
Those stories you'll find in the New Scientist magazine next week, and of course also on newscientist.com.